Back in late January, we reported on the generous compensation of Vikram Pandit, the CEO of Citigroup. He was in charge of that financial institution, once the world's largest, during the 2008 economic meltdown, laying off more than 50,000 employees in the process and taking more than $45 million in bailout money from TARP, the government's Troubled Asset Relief Program. A few days ago, to the surprise of many, Mr. Pandit resigned, reportedly in a dispute with the bank's board over its poor performance. Shares fell 89% during his tenure, billions of them issued to pay off what Citicorp owed TARP. But in spite of all that, it's estimated that during his 5 years at the helm, Mr. Pandit has been paid $261 million. You heard right. And if you're appalled by that, so is the man who held the thankless job of bailout sheriff, the cop on the beat, the special inspector general in charge of policing TARP and ferreting out waste, fraud, and abuse. The banks didn't make it easy, and unfortunately, neither did the U.S. government. Neil Barofsky had been a federal prosecutor chasing down Colombia drug lords. That was a cinch by comparison. He tells the whole story in this book, Bailout, an inside account of how Washington abandoned Main Street while rescuing Wall Street. Currently, he's a senior fellow and adjunct professor at the New York University School of Law, and he's with me now. Neil Barofsky, welcome.
Thank you.
What went through your mind when you heard that Mr. Pandit had resigned?
I think the biggest thing is now, finally, after all of this time, I mean, you talked about the level of his compensation. I mean, this was a CEO, and granted, he came in 2007 when the financial crisis was really picking up steam, but he's a guy who couldn't right his ship even after receiving $45 billion in taxpayer cash, $306 billion guarantee of his toxic assets, tens and tens of billions of dollars of deferred tax assets that he should have lost that helped buoy the stock price of Citigroup, but got a special waiver from Treasury in order to keep. And I think perhaps most remarkably of all, among his peers of bailed out banks, the only one in which the United States government had to move down the equity ladder and become common shareholders to the point where we owned, and by we I do mean we, all as taxpayers, owned a third of the company, had to go through all those extraordinary things in order to stabilize his bank and ensure they were able to pay back and get out of it after a lot of very bank-friendly policies that to help them to do so. But I think that you have to view his career through that prism of being, really one of the worst performing of a bunch of bad banks, and to receive all that money and really to accomplish what he accomplished was mostly because of taxpayer generosity and the incredible political connections that Citigroup had in Washington and basically cashing out those connections.
I still don't understand how that can happen, how you can be rewarded so handsomely with taxpayer money for bad behavior.
It is this incredible concept in Washington, and I saw that within the Treasury Department, almost from day one. And it is subscribing to this very Wall Street ideology that there are certain human beings who are so preternaturally, supernaturally gifted human beings that run these institutions that, of course, they're worth every penny that they receive. And of course, they must meet each other's salaries in order to keep them, when I think the reality is that they're ordinary people, maybe perhaps a little bit smarter than most and maybe a little bit more experienced in certain ways. But the notion that they're worth these tens and hundreds of millions of dollars of pay packages, which they receive for doing remarkably ordinary and in, I think, Pandit's case, arguably subordinary conduct, is very much ingrained in that culture. And which is why when you saw the government, when we were doing these bailouts and having a little bit of opportunity to have more control, didn't press for that type of serious executive compensation reform, and in fact really went out of their way to make sure a lot of these executives got huge bonuses, including at perhaps one of the worst of the bailout institutions, AIG.
You write in here about how there was supposed to be an effort to hold compensation accountable. I mean, to tame it in light of what had happened, but you lost that fight. Why? Who was in charge of making those decisions about the compensation of these guys?
When the money was first going out the door, that was done by the Bush administration and Secretary Paulson, who put in the most minimal executive compensation restrictions imaginable, only those that sort of Congress forced them to do in passing the statute. And that was based on his ideology that he thought they would be counterproductive. You could scare people away from the program or scare executives away that were necessary.
This is the Secretary of the Treasury.
Secretary of the Treasury.
Who had been on Wall Street.
And had received that level of compensation as the CEO of Goldman Sachs. And then it was continued, I think, when Secretary Tim Geithner took over as Secretary of the Treasury under the Obama administration, with just as much zeal to protect these executives. And AIG was really the flashpoint.
How so?
Well, in AIG, they had a contractual provision that they're going to pay out, it was $163 million to a small group of executives at the subunit AIG that really caused its eventual collapse and the need for a $180 billion bailout. And Secretary Geithner approved those payments, which were at that point being made with taxpayer money. There was no money at AIG in itself. It was dependent on the taxpayer. I mean, this included 20 people getting $2 million bonuses and higher. And he approved those. And publicly, the explanation was, well, we need to do this because we can't violate the contract, and it's distasteful and disgraceful and awful. But inside the Treasury Department, I was hearing a much different story. What I was told, not by Geithner himself, but by some of his lieutenants, was that we had to make those payments because we had to keep those individuals in place, because otherwise we would risk losing them, that they were essential to unwind these complex transactions. And for me, this was sort of an otherworldly type of moment. First of all, I can't imagine there was a huge market demand for AIG executives who had just destroyed their company out in the market. But secondly, you know, so much of finance, it's not as complex as a lot of the people on the inside like to make you think that it is. And I think they push this myth of complexity. But the bottom line is that the people I was dealing with had either earned those types of salaries on Wall Street before they came back to government, or were aspiring to get those salaries. So they don't really have the incentive of upsetting the apple cart or breaking that status quo, because they've either benefited or want to benefit from it once again.
As I understand it, AIG owed money to Goldman Sachs and other banks. So when the government stepped in to help AIG, it was really an indirect subsidy to Goldman Sachs and those other banks.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of times when you're talking about bailouts, there's two things to keep in mind. First of all, obviously, you're rescuing the institution and their executives, but that's almost a secondary effect. The real goal in most bailouts is to make good for the counterparties and the creditors, the people who are on the other side of the transaction of entities like AIG, because if there's no bailout, AIG defaults on their obligations, and all of those big banks and big financial institutions on the other side are going to have to recognize losses. And that's sort of the real destabilizing concern. So we bailed out AIG, sure, to help AIG, but it was much more about the banks on the other side of that transactions. Just like when Europe is talking about bailing out the European government, what they're really talking about when they're bailing out Greece or Spain is bailing out the banks that lent all the money to those countries. So bank bailouts or institutional bailouts or country bailouts usually come all back to the same thing, making sure that the banks on the other side of these transactions are made whole.
When you learned that the White House was opposing cutting down the size of these big banks and were for bailing them out and making them bigger, what did you understand to be the motive, to be the reason?
You know, I went through sort of a mental process, and my deputy was also a lifelong Democrat. We sort of went through this together. And as we saw these bad policies come down, we kept telling ourselves, you know what, this is just Secretary Geithner. This is not the president. If the president only knew what was going on, all of this would change. It would be different. We really believed in that. But over time, we came to realize that that just wasn't the case. You know, for me, the turning point was in July 2009. The president had a press conference on healthcare reform. And one of the only questions asked not about healthcare reform was about me, which caused me to have a small little heart attack when I was home watching it on TV. But was confronting him about the lack of transparency in the Treasury Department.
The TARP Inspector General recently said that your White House is withholding too much information on the bank bailouts. So my question for you is, are you fulfilling your promise of transparency in the White House?
With respect to TARP, let me take a look at what exactly they say we have not provided. I think that we've provided much greater transparency than existed prior to our administration coming in. It is a big program. I don't know exactly what's been requested. I'll find out, and I will have an answer for you.
Now, I wouldn't say I was expecting the next day to get a call from the president, but I thought maybe, okay, some reaching out from the White House, or maybe some sort of change. But at that point, I knew that the president himself knew about what we were doing and knew about what the Treasury Department was pushing back and what it was refusing to do. And nothing ever changed from that point.
Are you disappointed in him?
Very much.
How so?
I thought that if there was ever going to be a political figure that would take on the interests of Wall Street, that would put the American people, struggling homeowners, the middle class, all the people that were supposed to be helped by these bailouts, above that of the moneyed interest in Wall Street, it was going to be President Obama. And that just didn't happen. It was the exact opposite of that. He had the same ideology as Secretary Geithner, and frankly, the same ideology as a lot of those people who came from Wall Street. And
Which was?
protect the banks. Protect the biggest banks. What's best for the biggest banks is best for the country. We need to have these behemoths because of their incredibly important role in our society and for us to function.
I don't know if you saw the comment by the billionaire Charlie Munger, who is Warren Buffett's partner at Berkshire Hathaway. He said that anyone who wants to complain about the Wall Street bailout should realize they were, quote, absolutely required to save your civilization. Is that what the bailout saved, or did they save bad behavior and business as usual?
Look, it helped save a very, very broken financial system. And unfortunately, what's happened since then is preserving that very broken financial system. Now, look, what Munger is saying, that to which there is some validity, had we done nothing and let it collapse, it is a very real possibility that we could have seen an economic calamity on par with the Great Depression. Now, there's no way to prove that is true or false. That's a counterfactual example. But I know from my being down there that the people that I spoke to truly believed that that was the case, and were certainly not willing to roll the dice and find out if the normal mechanisms of capitalism would work with respect to these financial institutions. They believed it would have killed the financial system. And in September of 2008, it is consistent that our entire financial system was locking down. So I think there's some validity to that point. What is completely invalid to that point is to say that, okay, since we saved the financial system in its current form, that, okay, well, we should be happy with that, we should celebrate it, we should do high fives and spike the football and declare mission accomplished. Because that broken system is still in place. The incentives that led to crisis in 2008 are still there. We took banks that were too big to fail and required a bailout and made them bigger, 20 to 25% bigger today than they were back then. We still have a too big to fail problem. We still have all of the bad incentives in that financial system still in place, and we still have that same political power that these banks enjoy in place. Meanwhile, a bailout that was supposed to not just help the banks, but was supposed to help Main Street, was supposed to spur economic recovery, was supposed to preserve home ownership, it failed in every one of those goals as well. So I think Munger is right in one aspect, that it's better not to have our financial system disappear. He's wrong in every other material aspect. And frankly, to me, those aspects are a lot more important than just the simple goal of, hey, let's shovel hundreds of billions of taxpayer money into the banks and trillions of dollars of free money, and surprise, surprise, we saved a system.
As you suggest in Bailout, isn't there that constant soft sound of the revolving door in the ears of everyone, because they know if they waited out play ball for Wall Street, there's a pot of gold waiting for them when they want a job outside of government?
I mean, the only thing that's truly remarkable at the confrontation I had at Treasury was how it was set forth for me in such stark terms. But that's quietly has to be in the mind of everyone in the regulatory community, and they have to make a decision of which way to go because they're presented that choice, whether it's made explicitly to them or not. But you also have to remember that the other aspect of the revolving door is who's their boss? Who is that presidentially appointed person who came in? And you don't really move ahead in government or any other organization if you start espousing an ideology that directly contradicts that of your boss. So, a fish rots from its head, as the old phrase goes. So if your boss, your assistant secretary, the head of your department, comes from Bear Stearns or Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan Chase, that also creates a dampening effect on how effective and how robust the regulators underneath them might be. And to me, that's a lot of what faces a lot of regulators, this choice of either doing their jobs aggressively and potentially harming their future prospects, or playing ball, pulling punches, and getting ahead either within government or potentially out on Wall Street with a big pot of gold. And so I think that's part of the problem of a regulatory system, which when combined with the incredible power and influence and money that flows into Washington from these too big to fail institutions, that creates this sort of toxic cocktail of incentives for bad regulation, incentives for greater and greater risk, and an unbalanced balance of power that sits in Wall Street that's setting us up for another crisis.
Talk about that money, that flood of money. The cliche is a tsunami of money that goes from Wall Street to Washington. How does it work its will?
You know, there's not like bags of money with a giant dollar sign that are being handed, although I guess that I'm sure that does happen in certain circumstances, but I don't think that's not how the banks flex their muscle, not through outright direct corruption. And in a way, it's a shame, because that would be a lot easier to deal with. Like, we know we could set up a wiretap, we could set up surveillance, we can grab the money, we could find it in the congressman's refrigerator or something like that. Those are easy ways of types of corruption to deal with. Here, it's a lot more insidious. So the money is in campaign contributions, of course, and tremendous amount of influence goes to these members of Congress who most of them probably spend at least half of their time raising money for the next election as they are actually governing the country. But it's also in the army of lobbyists and influence peddlers who blanket Washington and advocating their point of view, really to the exclusion and shouting out contrary views. And they get this informational advantage, this sort of asymmetrical information that congressmen and regulators and their staffs receive with this overwhelming presence. So that only one side of the story gets told. Right. So things that are frankly just not true about how complex things are and how you really can't understand this, but you have to understand if you did this type of regulation or that type of limitation, you would destroy the entire global economy and you will put us at a disadvantage from those European and Asian banks. And that's really how the battle is fought in the trenches with the lawyers, the lobbyists, the campaign contributions, that creates this almost deification of those who control those levers of power. And I think we saw that a little bit over the course of this summer when Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Chase, came down from New York to Washington to testify about a multi-billion-dollar loss that he had. And the reaction, particularly in the Senate, was they were almost bowing at the altar of too big to fail bank. And it really gives you a sense where the power is. And when you see this type of obsequiousness, and that's what we saw at these hearings, obsequiousness, when you're a regulator watching this, you get that message of where the power lies.
You are a prosecutor of what has happened, not a prognosticator of what is to come. But how long does your intuition tell you we have before the next panic?
I don't know, and as you said, that's I'm not in that business, and I don't think I can make a great prediction. I think what's striking to me is that it could happen very, very soon. As part of the Dodd-Frank process and some degree of increased transparency, JP Chase, some official gave some presentation which said that a $50 billion hit to the bank could potentially trigger a run that would destroy the bank. And this is generally considered the safest, least prone to risk, fortress balance sheet bank. And they lost $6 billion in a blink of an eye, not because of any external shock, not because
earlier this
over the course of this summer, but because of a bad derivatives bet that went the wrong way against them. So that's kind of pretty much well on your way to $50 billion if you're losing $6 on something that has nothing to do with an external shock. So what happens if Europe collapses? What happens if the next asset that they're all herded into, the way they were with real estate here in the United States, or sovereign debt as they were in Europe, when that other shoe drops? Look, that could happen next year. It could happen in 2 years. It can happen in 4 years. And there's lots of intervening events that can happen as well. Sooner or later, everything I've learned and everything I understand about incentives tell me it's going to happen. But when? It could be tomorrow. It could be 5 or 6 years from now.
In the meantime, I hope everyone reads Bailout, an inside account of how Washington abandoned Main Street while rescuing Wall Street. Neil Barofsky, thank you for being with me.
Thank you for having me.